discuss the issue of economic equality in Malaysia. And we're more pleased to see this very encouraging response after a very exciting week in Malaysian social media. People are talking about the Listen parodies, people are talking about Patrick Teo's outbursts, but we still nonetheless get a pretty decent crowd to talk about a less fashionable topic, which is economic inequality. My name is Ahmad Fuad Rahman. I am a member of Islamic Renaissance Front, and I also manage projectdialogue.com. And for Islamic Renaissance Front, one of the things, while we are a religious organization, we also believe that Muslims should be more invested in other seemingly non-religious issues, inequality being one of them. Previously, we've had forums discussing ethnic inequality, inequality between religious communities, but today we want to bring our focus to discussing economic inequality. And with us today, three figures we believe who can do a really good job to shed light on this issue, to give more perspective on how to view it than we would otherwise get in the mainstream media. At any rate, our perspective, our belief is that this issue is not given enough attention and it's not discussed as deeply as it should be, especially given the increasing rate of inequality, which I'm sure our speaker will talk about. To start us off, we have Saudari Mary Pereira. First of all, I must apologize, the poster is a bit misleading. She's actually here in the capacity as an academic who has been, who was teaching at UiTM for 30 years and teaching political science there. And her involvement with Tenaga Nita was in coordinating a report that was released on inequality in Malaysia called Washing the Tigers. It's a very in-depth report, I think it's about 300 pages, over 300 pages. And it covers all aspects of inequality in Malaysia, not just economic. And you can just Google this, if you want to know more about this report, just Google Washing the Tigers. And it was conducted by Tenaga Nita Equal Rights Trust in the UK. And Mary Pereira was the coordinator of that report. So she's not a member of Tenaga Nita. Her affiliation with Tenaga Nita was through that project. But our poster maker somehow didn't want, took the liberty to just put the word Tenaga Nita there. So apologies if that was in any way misleading. So without further ado, I shall pass the floor to her and she can start our discussion. So please welcome Saudari Mary Pereira.
Thanks, Fuad. I was actually an employee of Tenaga Nita for a year. I left the university after 30 years when they refused to give me the opportunity to continue teaching politics, and they refused to give me the opportunity to do research on minimum wage. So then I decided, okay, that was enough then in the university. But I enjoyed my work. I loved teaching politics to Malay students. All my students were Malays, a few from East Malaysia, but 90%, 95% were Malays, and I really enjoyed teaching politics to the Malays. After I left the university, I worked for a year at Tenaga Nita, where I coordinated this project called the Equality Project, which was in partnership with the Equal Rights Trust of UK. And what I'm presenting today will not be just based on my work in Tenaga Nita while coordinating the project. I've also, I can't help it, it's my 30 years as an academic that comes in more than my 1 year in Tenaga Nita. So whatever I present will be based on my personal experience as an academic, some research I've done, as well as a lot of secondary sources, research done by other people, UKM lecturer, World Bank reports, government reports, a lot of government statistics that I've used to prepare my presentation for today. So maybe I should just start off with the concept of equality. We are looking at economic inequality, but before we look at inequality, let's look at what is equality. And equality is a right that is very basic and inherent. All human beings have a right to equality. It is not something given to us by the government and that can be taken away by the government. It is inherent, God-given. And I think that is something very basic which everyone should understand. If I were to look at certain very fundamental features about equality, the thing that stands out the most will be the concept of equity, justice and fairness, and the idea of dignity, respect and consideration. And dignity here involves not just dignity that comes from the enjoyment of fulfillment of material needs, but also psychological needs. For example, it's not just when a person has a roof over his head and food and clothes, health facilities, then he has dignity. But it's also the psychological need, a sense of security, no fear of tomorrow. That's a psychological need, and that is part of this concept of dignity. When we talk about equality also, a lot of people forget that equality is not just formal equality, but substantive equality. And when we say substantive equality, what we mean is we are looking at outcomes. The government can carry out a lot of programs to help the poor, but what was the result? Did it really result in equality, in addressing the inequality? If it didn't, then there is no equality. So we are looking at substantive equality, we are looking at equality of opportunities, equality of outcomes. And when we look at the issue as substantive equality, then we are looking at indirect discrimination, discrimination that's not so obvious, that is camouflaged. We are looking at systemic discrimination. Some of the policies may have discrimination inbuilt into the policy. And people don't even realize it. The policy is supposed to help the poor, but the way the policy is being formulated and implemented, it actually results in discriminating against the very people it's supposed to help. Equality also looks at equal participation. And when we say equal participation, it's in all areas of life. Malaysia, for many, many years, the government had a tendency to say that political, social rights can wait. We will focus on economic rights first. We will look at economic equality first, and then only political and social equality. But equality cannot be broken up and cut up and divided in that way. For meaningful equality, it has to be in all areas of life. Equal protection before the law, free from discrimination on all grounds. So we are looking at an integrated approach to equality, a holistic approach. And this is an approach that we used in our research on inequality and discrimination in Malaysia, and we came out with a report called Opportunity. So we used a holistic approach. Now let me look at economic inequality specifically. For me, economic inequality, we are referring to disparities between individuals and groups. And economic inequality or disparities between individuals and groups, the usual way of looking at it is by looking at income differentials. The usual manifestation of economic inequality will be to look at who earns more, who earns less. That is the usual way. But I think to have a more meaningful discourse about economic inequality, we have to look at many other aspects. And this would be asset ownership as well. And asset ownership here would mean both real estate assets as well as financial assets. So for example, a person may be earning very little in terms of income, but he may have 3 houses, all paid for, or maybe earning rental, right? He may have shares, he may have savings in the bank, which earns him interest and dividends. So to have a meaningful discussion about inequality, economic inequality, we have to look at not just the income he earns, but the assets he owns. Also, we have to look at socio-economic security. When I say socio-economic security, we are looking at what kind of protection do people have when, for example, they fall sick and are unable to work anymore. Or because of old age, they are unable to work anymore. Or they have met with an accident at the workplace, or accidents of when they cannot work anymore. Maybe the person is pregnant and unable to work. Then, is there economic equality for that person? So there must be adequate protection in these areas, and this is what we call socio-economic security. So some groups of people may have better socio-economic security compared to others. Right? And the gap in that between these two groups is also one aspect of economic inequality. Access to capital, this is what Jeffrey Sachs talks about in his writings. And he says that the extreme poor usually lack access to capital. And capital here can be in many different forms. It can be human capital, business capital, infrastructure capital, natural capital, institutional knowledge capital. What it all means is basically human capital, you have health, nutrition, skills. Business capital, people have machinery, facilities, transport, so on. Institutional will refer to laws, government services, judiciary, security. Knowledge will be scientific and technical know-how. So people who have access to this kind of capital usually are better off compared to people who do not have access to this type of capital. So the gap arises because of that. I've also included participation and voice because as a political scientist, I used to teach politics for many, many years. And this is one area which is always neglected. Whether people have the ability to influence policymakers. And if you notice, usually it's the poor who have no voice. It is the rich, the powerful who have voice. And because they have voice, they are able to influence government. They are able to influence policies. So the government listens to the investor, the foreign investor, the local investors. The government listens to the employer more than the ordinary worker, because the rich usually have voice. So we live, democracy is not perfect. Democracy is very imperfect, right? And people with a louder voice are heard rather than people with no voice. Now when we talk about disparities, very often these disparities are intersecting or overlapping. You'll find that, now what I mean by here is, although you have many types of disparities, disparity based on ethnicity or region or gender, citizenship, economic sector and so on, but sometimes they overlap. So the same individual or the same group of people may suffer disparity or may experience inequality, economic inequality on a few different grounds at the same time. For example, a woman may also, a woman from, an Indian woman from the rural area working in the agricultural sector is worse off than a man working in the services sector from a different ethnicity. So this is where we mean that a person who suffers from, a person who experiences economic inequality may experience it from many different fronts at many different levels, not just one. Just a brief look at the current situation. As I said, my data is basically from available public sources. I have not really done a thorough study of the issue because I usually don't talk about economic inequality. But from what I've gathered so far, right? GDP for 2012, at least 5%, it's a little bit more than 5% now. The government, the national government is reasonably happy with their performance. But if you look at the 5% GDP growth, and we look at the targets which have been set by the government, we probably won't achieve those targets because many of those targets were set assuming that the growth will be 8%. So that in that sense we may not achieve some targets. Household income, those earning less than 2,500 ringgit. In 2004, 56.2%, 2009, 44.2% of the population. Household monthly income of more than 5,000 ringgit per month, 2004, 16.8%, 2009, 24.2%. So the good part about it, the nice thing about this is the lower income group, those earning below 2,500, there's a decreasing trend, seems to be going down in numbers, and the group that's above 5,000, increasing trend. So it looks like everybody's income is growing. Poverty rate, Malaysia has always been praised for this. We are star performer as far as poverty rate reduction is concerned. And 2009 is 3.8%. But, and since 1999, government statistics shows a drop in poverty rate, average poverty rate. But again, this is based on the government poverty line income, which is, many people have said, very unrealistic, although it has been adjusted in the last few years. What is it now? Around 800, average of 800, because rural areas is a little bit higher. East Malaysia, they have different regions adjusted for regional differences and all. So around 750 to 800, around there. Okay? But this 3.8% basically camouflages a lot of inequality, economic inequality from other perspectives. If you look deeper into this, you see a lot of other areas of inequality. So 3.8 looks nice on paper, but what happens in reality is something else. Let me look at wealth distribution. Again, I've only had access to 2007 figures. And this is basically from a research done by Muhammad Abdul Khalid of UKM. I found this interesting because this research was a bit different from the way the government usually does its measurement of poverty. Because the government usually looks at income. But in this research, this academic looked at the concept of wealth. And wealth here includes financial assets and property assets. And what this research showed was that the income gap may be less than the gap in property ownership and wealth ownership, right? So this is what I was talking about, people who may have 2-3 houses but the income is low, right? So if you look at wealth as an indicator, then you find that the top 20% of the population, top 20% of nations, they control 52.1% of the wealth, the total wealth, top 20%. The middle 40% control 39.9%, and the bottom 40% only control 8% of total wealth. So you can see the gap between the rich and the poor. It's a very big gap. And if you compare that with the last column, which is income, you find that the gap doesn't seem to be too big if you use just income as an indicator. But if you use wealth as an indicator, then the gap is much bigger. Right? So now, of course, when you look at these figures, wealth distribution in Malaysia is still better than many of the developed countries even. Right? Because in some of the developed countries, with the GDP growing higher, the distribution of wealth, actually, the distribution of income became worse. Right? So when we compare with other countries, there are other developed countries which are worse off than Malaysia in their distribution. But it still requires that we should monitor the situation. Now, let me look at ethnic inequality, because this is the usual thing that people are concerned about in Malaysia. This is the usual thing that politicians talk about. This is the usual thing that many Malaysians are concerned about. Although I don't think this is the biggest issue. Now, inter-ethnic inequality, I just want to look at only I want to focus on one aspect in terms of wealth. And again, taking from the earlier research, Malaysians with zero wealth. Bumiputra, 72%. That means we're looking at all those who are considered to have zero wealth, right? And the Bumiputra make up the biggest percentage there. Chinese, 17%. Indians, 10.7%. Now, Bumiputra here, if you look at many government statistics now, Bumiputra includes Malays and non-Malay Bumiputras. So it camouflages the disparity between Malays and Orang Asal. Orang Asli, the indigenous from Sabah and Sarawak, it camouflages, it hides that difference. So when you lump them together, you're not able to see who exactly. Is it the Malays or is it the Orang Asli or is it the indigenous groups? But this is what that particular research has come up with. People with zero wealth, most of them are Bumiputras. So although in terms of income differential, if you look at just income over the years, inter-ethnic income difference, there seems to be a drop. But if you look at other asset classes, then it's wide. Right? Especially between the Bumiputra and Chinese in the bottom 20% of the population.
What aspect of wealth is that? Is that savings and assets or
property, real estate and financial.
Real estate, financial. So wealth in that sense.
Yeah.
So they might have regular income but no real estate, no financial assets like securities and stuff.
Now let's look at intra-ethnic wealth distribution. Now this is also an area which a lot of people ignore because they're so caught up with inter-ethnic, right? Malays and Chinese, Malays and non-Malays. But they forget about looking at within each ethnic group what's happening. Right? So if you look at intra-ethnic wealth distribution, then you will find that there is inequality within each ethnic group as well. Right? So for the Bumiputras, the top 20% control or own 50.8% of wealth. The middle 40%, 41.6%, the bottom 40%, 7.6%. When you compare with the Chinese and the Indians, you see the same pattern basically. The top 20% control about 50% of the wealth, and the bottom 40% or the rest of the 80% control the balance, and the bottom 40% especially are controlled 10% or less of the wealth. Now, why is this happening? In fact, based on the research done by this academic, he says that it is certain government policies which have actually contributed to widening the disparities in wealth between different classes of people, looking at the rich, the middle income and the poor. Right? So within intra-ethnic and inter-ethnic as well, certain government policies have contributed towards this disparity. What are some, if I can give some examples? Liberalization of higher education. A lot of people are very happy, right? We have more private colleges, right? A lot of people can go to university now. But, and then meritocracy. Now, meritocracy doesn't always translate into justice. Meritocracy can be fair if there's a level playing field. If people start off equal. But when you don't start off equal, meritocracy works to the disadvantage of the weaker sections. So when the government introduced this kind of criteria in universities, many of the children from poor families do not have the minimum grades that you require to further the studies. I've seen this personally when I was in UITM, and we used to have education fairs to encourage students come and register, and I used to feel so sad, you know, when this pakcik will come with his son or the daughter want to register for a diploma course, but then he doesn't have 5 credits, or doesn't have a credit in English or BM or maths. You know, a lot of them require credits in maths, English, BM, and they don't have that, right? Because they come from rural areas where they don't have the good, don't have good schools, or don't have the teachers, or they're not from the background where they speak English, all these things. So it affects their performance academically. They can't go for tuition, like many rich kids can do. So they are denied the opportunity to move upward. If you look at residential schools, Mara Junior Science, science schools, even UITM, it'll be interesting to see what is the breakdown if you look at how many percent come from poor families and how many percent come from rich families in these kind of educational institutions, which are very heavily subsidized by taxpayers. So even a simple thing like I was just listening to BFM yesterday, and there was a discussion on the Prima housing scheme, and they were talking about how the Prima housing scheme actually makes it easier for people who already own 1, 2 or 3 houses to own another house. It makes it very difficult for people who don't have a house at all to own a house under the Prima housing scheme, which was actually set up by the government to help people who don't have houses to buy houses. So these are things which we need to look into in greater detail. Okay, so that was ethnic disparities. Let me look at regional disparities. Now, urban-rural disparity. Rural areas, generally speaking, the poverty rate is about double in the urban areas. I only have 1999 and 2004 figures here. 1 is to 1.81 urban-rural, and in 2004, 1 is to 2.11. It may have gone down now. I don't have the newer figures on that. But generally, based on a World Bank study, rural areas have, especially in East Malaysia, look at East Malaysia, the scenario there is lower wages and higher informality. When we say higher informality, what we mean is people are usually in contract jobs, short-term contracts, part-time, temporary jobs, right, with very little income security. They can lose their job anytime.
The first ratio is on average income.
No. Urban is to rural ratio. Poverty rate in urban is to rural.
The not disparity?
No, the ratio of poverty. Wages in East Malaysia is 57% the hourly rate in West Malaysia. This is based on World Bank study. The highest poverty rate is in Sabah, 19.7%. So although overall for Malaysia is 3.8%, but for Sabah it's 19.7%. Highest median monthly household income, Putrajaya, KL, Selangor, between 5,400 ringgit to 4,300 ringgit. Lowest median monthly household income, Kedah, Perlis, Kelantan, between ringgit 1,900 to ringgit 1,700. Now, again, there is a correlation. Like I said, inequality, there's an overlap over other areas. Very often you see that the working age population in East Malaysia also has lower educational levels. So there is a correlation there. But some research shows that public expenditure programs by the government to benefit urban households, public expenditure programs by the government have actually benefited urban households more than rural households. So, and this is for all ethnic groups. So it seems to me like the urban households are the ones who are able to benefit more from what the government is spending money on, the programs that the government is spending money on. Okay, let's look at gender disparities. Employment rate, in terms of employment rate for males, this is participation in the labour market. Yeah? For males is 79.7%, female 47.9%, and this was in 2011. And basically it's stabilized generally over the last few years at these levels. So it shows what percentage of women are able to get into the workforce, right? And it is still low by regional and international standards. And especially after marriage, women there's a trend for women to get out of the workforce after marriage. But in many other countries, after marriage, they come out of the labour market, and then after a few years, they get back into the labour market. But that doesn't seem to be happening in Malaysia. Low percentage of women in top private sector management positions. Men paid 15% to 17% higher than women. This is based on studies done by the World Bank. So this is again due to unequal access to employment opportunities, promotion, salary increase. There's also less socio-economic security for women and LGBTI. In our research for the Washing the Tigers, we interviewed a number of transsexual persons. Some people are not familiar with LGBTI, is it? Right, transsexuals, and they especially face a lot of discrimination and harassment when it comes to employment, when it comes to even educational opportunities. So many of them, women especially, are in temporary or contract or part-time jobs, or they work from home where they have very little access to employment benefits. And they also face a lot of hazards at the workplace. There is an increase in gender gap for Indian and non-Malay Bumi women. The statistics shows that the gender gap has increased for Indian women and non-Malay Bumi women. And poverty rate, right? There's a higher probability of poverty in female-headed households. For example, women who are widows or separated, right? There's a higher rate of poverty among this group. Now, I want to focus on the solutions. But maybe on the foreign workers. Yeah, I want to go through very fast.
Solutions.
What foreign workers?
Can you just give a quick summary?
Okay, foreign workers generally suffer economic inequality, which a lot of Malaysians are not bothered about. Because they say, well, they're foreigners. Right? They're not one of us. But they do suffer discrimination in many forms. Many of them are basically like slaves, bonded labor. So, and the government policy seems to change every now and then in terms of providing protection for them. I want to go directly to the solutions, because I think that's the more interesting part. So, how many of you say the solution is to change the government? Well, I expected the whole group to have their hands.
See your arguments first.
To use, to see what?
See your arguments.
Oh, okay. Now, like I will use Dr. Mahathir's words, right? You want to topple the government. Dr. Mahathir talks as if changing the government is a big crime, it's a big sin. It's not. It's a very normal process in a democracy. Right? It's very normal, very natural. Okay? And especially when you read his comments about his idea of what is a strong government and what is a weak government is really shocking. Right? I think changing the government, the question we have to ask is, will changing the government solve our problems? Solve the problems that we have been talking about, that I presented, right? For me personally, the UMNO-led government had 56 years to get their act together, right? For many years, they had 2/3 majority in parliament. GDP growth was very good, right? 8% for many years. They had all the resources available. So I personally expect more from my government. Expect better from my government, right? But the question we have to ask is, can Pakatan Rakyat do a better job in addressing economic inequality? We have seen some of the strategies that they have proposed in their Buku Jingga, for example, right? And they seem to be quite specific in some of their areas of focus. But to me, that is no guarantee that they will do better. And I'm not too worried anyway, even if they lose. Because what is more important for me is we need a strong and credible opposition. That is a more important issue for me. Because you see, in the last 4 years, because we have a strong and credible opposition in the last 4 years, it has forced the ruling party to work harder, right? To be a better government, not to take the citizens for granted. So I think the minimum that I will be hoping for is at least a strong and credible opposition. But more than that, I will rather focus on other issues. Yes, we need a change of government. I still feel that we need a change of government. But a change of government without changes in other areas, it's not going to make any difference for us as Malaysians. We want a better future, right? So I've, not necessarily in terms of importance, I've just listed down some things that I find, that I feel are important. I want politicians, I want people in government who will stop treating citizens like as if we are idiots and get away with it, right? If you look at some of the responses given to the RCI findings, for example, the law allows us to do this, right? I think they're treating citizens like idiots. So this is where empowerment of Malaysians becomes important. Doesn't matter who is in power, but we need Malaysians to be empowered, right? So that they can hold the government accountable for its actions, so that they can influence public policy, so that they will have a voice in policy making, especially the vulnerable groups. It is not a question of majority versus minority, because the majority does not always, it's not always right. It's not a question of majority and minority. Due to government efforts, there have been empowerment of people without them realizing it. Through education, internet access, people have become empowered. But a lot of NGOs, especially grassroots NGOs, have played a very important role there. And that needs to continue, right? Malaysians need to realize that we have to be responsible for our country, for our future. And things like even rights, we have to stand up for our rights at the workplace. Employers don't own the employee, right? They are paying for our labor power, but the employer cannot take away your political rights, your right to political participation, your right to your political views, or membership in political parties. The employer cannot take away those rights, and that is happening in Malaysia here, right? We need a government with political will, which is motivated by the common good and not by political expediency. Government is supposed to protect the weaker segments of society, right? We need a culture of rewarding integrity and competence in all sectors. I'm not just talking about in civil service, I'm talking about in parliament, in the judiciary, in the private sector, in NGOs. We need this culture of rewarding integrity. we need structural reforms towards humane capitalism. And what structural reforms include changes in laws which are discriminatory, from the constitution to labor laws to policies, right? Wherever there are elements which allow for discrimination, these have to be changed. Now, of course, the devil is in the details, but I think we have enough experts in Malaysia to handle the devil. So, to me, I'm very hopeful. Thank you.